new path. All right, let's get on with it, shall we? I am so honored to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Christopher Emden is a social critic, public intellectual, and science advocate whose commentary on issues of race, culture, inequality, and education have appeared in dozens of influential periodicals, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Forbes, and the Atlantic Journal-Constitution. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at Teachers College at Columbia University, where he also serves as Director of Secondary School Initiatives in the Urban Science Education Center. Dr. Emden writes the provocative Emdin 5 series on a number of contemporary social issues for the Huffington Post and draws on his extensive experience as a former physics and chemistry teacher, school administrator, and urban education researcher to write about topics that range from school bullying and student protests to parental involvement and the political landscape of urban America. Dr. Emden holds a PhD in urban education with a concentration in mathematics, science, and technology, master's degrees in both natural sciences and education administration, and bachelor's degrees in physical anthropology, biology, and chemistry. Please help me welcome today's keynote speaker. Give it up for Dr. Christopher Emden.
Good morning, everyone. Let's try this again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are you doing? All right. So before I get into my talk, because that performance was just so amazing before, I'll give you guys a little rap verse. So people always think, oh, Christopher Emden's this PhD professor, but I like to call myself the MC with a PhD. So check this. I'm a physicist, lyricist, spitting this ridiculousness, so witness the ignorance I dismiss. Hold up. I'm a physicist / lyricist, I smash ignorance, it's a miss when I'm spitting this. See, Newton's laws of motion is the topic of the course, because things in motion stay in motion unless they hit an unbalanced force. Well, next up's the second law of situation and summation, force equals mass times acceleration. That's the second law Newton foresaw. If you want more, then the third law is in store. On. See, every force has an opposite force, and every action has an equal plus opposite reaction. The sum of all objects at rest is zero, unless the object is no longer relaxing. I mean in motion, that's change in location, till it hits traction, the coefficient of friction. Then it all comes to a full stop, and there goes Newton's laws over hip-hop. But hold up, I'm off Newton. I'm on to Einstein. I like Einstein because Einstein's mind is like mine. His formula was E equals MC squared, which is weird because me is your favorite MC squared. All right? So, thank you. So now that we've got that out of the way, I have two speeches I can give you. You got to select which one you want. So there's a regular speech, which is like Chris Emden, the professor guy, you know, and for that one I button my code. And then I give you like, you know, the professor speech. Or I can give you the second speech, which is a little bit more like, just like Chris, letting you guys know what you need to do to really change the game of education. But you have a choice. To give you more information, the first speech will make you very, very comfortable. And the second speech, at some point, somebody might possibly be a little bit offended. So do you want to have the first speech and be comfortable, or the second? So who wants the first one? Raise your hands. First one. Crickets. Okay. So who wants the second one? All right. You asked for the second one. All right? Keep that in mind, all right? So let's get going. So if you guys look at the slide that you see over there, it says progressive hip-hop ed, educational content. Where else have you seen something that looks like that? Parental advisory label on the cover of mostly rap albums. And that happens for a reason, of course, because there's some content in rap albums that you don't want your kids listening to. But at the same time, what that's caused is people to think that anything that has anything related to hip-hop is inherently negative. And so because of that, I'm part of this movement called Hip Hop Ed, hashtag Hip Hop Ed for the Twitter heads, that focuses on using that same notion of hip-hop as having negative things inherently in it, as hip-hop being the tool to transform education. That in order for us to really truly engage in progressive practices in education, we have to be students of and scholars of hip-hop culture. Next slide. There you go. So I'm a hip-hopper, I'm a scientist, I'm an educator, so I'm changing things, because in the spirit of hip-hop, we always have to keep people on their toes, so I'm remixing my talk. Initially, it was just hip-hop ed, now it's stem with no root bears no fruit. But in order for us to be truly engaged, when I say stem with no root, I need you guys to say bears no fruit. Can you do that for me? Stem with no root. Stem with no root. Stem with no root. A few people got it. When I changed my inflection, you change yours. Thank you for those 3 people who got it. All right? So on those slides, you see that first picture is actually President Obama. And President Obama was having a conversation with the best math and science teachers in the country. And he had them all sort of at the White House. And when I look at that picture, it's really interesting to me because he looks like a drop of chocolate in a bowl of milk or something, right? And then we have the second slide, which is this document called Science for All Americans. And in Science for All Americans, this is the idea that we want everybody in the United States to be an enthusiast of science. And then on the side there are the kids I work with every day in Harlem and the Bronx and New York City. And so when I look at the teachers in the first slide, and I look at the students in the third slide, I see some differences. Now, this is not to say that it's a problem when you have white educators or black and brown students, not at all. In fact, the differences I see aren't necessarily the race first. One is just the fact that the teachers are old, right? I mean, and the kids are young, right? And so because that's a fact, just because we teachers or educators and after-school workers and students are different age groups, sometimes there's different race and ethnicity differences, that means that there are cultural differences automatically. And I argue that the role for the educator is to find out the ways that we can bridge those cultural differences. Click. Next slide. Click again. Next slide. Click again. Next slide. Click one more time. We move on. So now, those things disappeared for a reason. They disappeared because in reality, when we look at education based on this notion of science for all Americans, or through this lens of multiculturalism as we know it, or through those other terms you see there, no child left behind, race to the top, a chance for every child, race around the block, drive up the corner, like all these names that we name all these issues in the world of education that are supposed to help us to meet the needs of young people, what we oftentimes realize is that there's a very significant component of those things that are always missing. And that in education in the United States, what we've done for a very long time is change the names of our initiatives, but never ever change our practice. Right? President Obama once said that education in the United States is the biggest civil rights issue of our time. And during the recent election, the last one that passed, Mitt Romney said, education is a civil rights issue of our era. Two folks who are seemingly diametrically opposed can identify the fact that issues in education are civil rights issues. But we can't change civil rights issues if we just change the names of the practices. We actually have to get to the point where we transform the practices. Next slide, or click. So I think of schools or perfect schools as this. Do you guys see that house? Who sees it? It's nice, it's pretty, green grass, smokestack, perfect, maybe not quite smokestack, but perfect. And that is how we oftentimes view education. That's sometimes how we view our after-school programs. That's the way our after-school programs look when people come to visit us. Perfect. Right? Right? And then people come in and are like, man, this is amazing. But in reality, click one more time, sometimes the structures of the home is what we need to focus on, and the structures are not quite so perfect. Click one more time. And I say, and I argue that in order for us to get to the perfection on a regular basis, we have to look at the structure of the home. In reality, what happens is you can have a pretty house with a destroyed foundation, and it will look pretty when people come to visit. But if you never address the foundation and the structures of the home, the house remains pretty for only so long. Eventually, it will start to come crumbling down, and when it does, it will crumble down with you in it. So my argument today is to focus on the fact that a stem with no root, a stem with no root, a home without a focus on the foundation will come crashing down on you. Next slide. So why do I say STEM? And click one more time. I click on STEM because obviously I'm a hip-hop guy, but I'm also a STEM advocate. Everybody knows what STEM stands for, right? Who wooed? Just remind me to give you a hug later. All right, so STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, I think is actually the area of discipline that we need to focus on the most when we talk about connecting youth culture. Why? Achievement gaps exist in all disciplines, English, arts, history, the works. But achievement gaps in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics triple or quadruple when it comes to youth of color. So if we focus explicitly on only the English and the arts and the history, it means then that we'll never get further because the achievement gaps in the STEM disciplines will forever pull us back. And so when I say STEM with no root, I'm thinking about a stem. Look at that stem. It's so green and fresh and it's like organic looking, and that stem, if I extracted it from its root, what would happen to it over time? It would die. It would wither. Next slide. It will end up looking like that. When you uproot a stem, it dies. Now, some people say, well, Dr. Emden, what if you took the stem, and it was a slight stem, and you put, water in a paper towel, and you wrapped it around the stem, then it would get enough water for it needed for a while, and it might sprout something. It would sprout something, but it would never bear fruit. And where we are in the United States is that we've gotten to a point where we are happy with the fact that some part of the stem is still somewhat green. We've got to the point where we're no longer concerned about the fact that they're no longer bearing any fruit. And in reality, what we have to do is we have to get to the root. So when I say STEM, I'm talking about a stem of a plant, but I'm talking again about STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. See what I did there? I'm so hip-hop, right? So a stem with no root bears no fruit. Click one more time. So where do you find a root? If you're going to a garden and you were looking at plants, where do you find the root? Is it at the top? Is it growing out of the sides? No. The roots are at the bottom. Where else do you find the root? It's at the bottom. Started from the bottom, now we're here. What else about the root? What else about the root? The root is also buried in the dirt, in the grime. If you want to get to the root, it means that you have to get your hands dirty. You can't ever be a gardener if you're scared of dirt. At the end, you can advocate for having the pretty things at the end, but you have to dig in deep. And where do we have the dirt, the grime? We find it in the underground. And where do we associate the underground with the most? We're talking again about hip-hop culture. Not just rap, but hip-hop culture. So now, indulge me for a bit. I'll put my blazer back on. I'm going to go quickly into professor mode. Those of you who are into theory, you're going to love this part. So, using a social cultural theoretical framework, we can really make some sense of how we can inform things that are going on in classrooms with young people. You see, every young person comes to the classroom with what sociologists call social capital. Everybody say social capital. Social capital is all the things that you bring to any social sphere by virtue of being from there. So, for example, all of you who wear glasses, we have shared social capital. Why? Because we all know what it feels like to be out in the rain, then all of a sudden walk into a building, and then our glasses get fogged up, and then we have to go like this. And all those who don't wear glasses, they just don't feel our pain. There's a certain understanding about the world that we have by virtue of being people who wear glasses. That's part of our shared social capital. Now, the thing with social capital is that social capital is meant to be shared. And people are likely to share their social capital with people who have the same capital they do. For example, if I was going to talk about glasses, I would talk to people who wear glasses. And we would have shared social capital, and all you non-glasses wearers, we would just ignore you. We'd just talk, and we'd be friends, and we'd talk about our experiences, and we have our shared social capital. Now, the thing about social capital is that social capital helps you to form what we call dense networks. What are dense networks? It's when you have somebody who has the same dispositions, skills, attributes, experiences as you are. What you want to do instinctively is just to connect to those people. So you say, you know what? We wear glasses. We both bald. Like we both wear blazers. And so we start talking, and we start having these formed, close, dense networks together. But what happens when you have dense networks is this. You start forgetting the fact that you need other people. Young people in classrooms have shared social capital, oftentimes based on hip-hop culture. We listen to the same music, we have the same dress, we have the same dance, we have the same understandings, and they connect closely to each other. And then when you come as an educator or an after-school person, and you want to put in your culture on young people who already have a shared dense network, can you get in? No. So what we have to do is what sociologists create what we call weak ties. Everybody say weak ties. Now, weak ties are just things you can do to connect to get in. So for example, you may not listen to the same music, you may not dress the same, you obviously aren't the same age anymore, sorry to break it to you, but one thing that you can do is you can have a curiosity about their culture. If you ask a young person to say, what song is in on the radio right now, I'd like to go practice that, they'll look at you like you're crazy, but it also comes with a recognition that you are willing to make some sort of a willingness to understand their culture. That becomes a weak tie. And a weak tie eventually transforms into what we call strong ties, and then strong ties opens up the world to STEM, and then we transform education. Because we know a STEM with no root, a STEM with no root, next slide. So now that we realize that hip-hop is the biggest weak tie, we've got to break this thing down. And we have to start looking at hip-hop as a pedagogical tool. Do you know what I do in my classrooms at Columbia when I teach my aspiring teachers? Some people say, Chris Emden, you probably have a bunch of new texts that you introduce to young people. No. They might say, you might, read passages from John Dewey and Piaget. And I say, nah. And I say, then they say, oh, I know what you're going to do. You're going to invite professors in education who are experts to come talk to your students. And I say, no. What I do is I put on rap videos. What? You're training aspiring teachers with rap videos? Yes. Why? Because rap performance is the most progressive approach to pedagogy that we have ever seen. You ever go to a rap concert and DJ Khaled or somebody says, and everybody's hands goes up, and they stay there, and 200,000 people put their hands up, and they stay there. And then he goes up, down, and it's up, down, up, down. And then you go into a classroom and the teacher says, who has an answer to the question? And no one's hands go up. The reality is that there's something in that hip-hop performance that the educator must be able to use as part of the instructions to be able to get the kind of response that the rap performer does. And so we look at the elements of hip-hop. MCing, what does an MC do? When an MC's on stage, they always talk with their hands. You ever see an MC on stage like this? And so something is small, it's minuscule, and something's large, it's grand. So if educators are in classrooms talking like the guy from the Clear Eyes commercial, and they can't describe the ideas using their hands like an MC does, guess what? That's a simple, basic thing that allows your instruction to be ineffective. Graffiti. I'm not asking you to go have kids vandalize property. No, no, no. I am saying, what is it about graffiti that makes people connect to it? Well, it's the fact that you get to put your name up and your fame up and your tag name up and your identity outside of the world becomes visible. So why can't we in classrooms then take one of our walls and paint it with blackboard paint and allow kids to just express themselves? Technology, DJing. DJs in hip-hop took 2 turntables and took little excerpts of songs and extended them forever. And this focus on technology and manipulating technology is part and parcel of hip-hop. I mean, if you think about Twitter, who are the first people on Twitter? Ashton Kutcher and rappers. There's this inherent need to focus on social media. Speaking of Twitter, who here has a Twitter account? Let me see your hands up if you have a Twitter account. All right, put your phones up. All right, right now, for the rest of the session, I want you to tweet live during the session. And I want you to use the hashtag HIPHOPED, Hip Hop Ed. You already did? So everybody's going to know that you're about that life. I love it. All right, next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. You're going to go on for a while. One more, one more, one more, one more. Stop. These are all the things in the elements of hip-hop that you can use to transform your classroom. Now to the next slide, one more time. Thank you. Which brings me to the theory of it. I can take my jacket off again, right? This idea of reality pedagogy. Who here has heard the term culturally relevant pedagogy? All the educators who took all those classes have heard it. And I think that because we are so comfortable with culturally relevant pedagogy, we've gotten to the point where we can't get to transformative pedagogy. Let me explain. If you teach a teacher that in order for them to be effective, they have to be culturally relevant, guess what they have to do? They have to make assumptions about what the culture is of young people. So pretty much, you're like, I'm going to be culturally relevant. I think the kids like this. I'm going to try it. I think the kids like this. I'm going to try it. But your cultural relevance, if it comes to a filter of you, no longer becomes culturally relevant. So I make the argument that what we need is a reality pedagogy. And reality pedagogy is based on hip-hop. This notion of hip-hop of you got to keep it real. And reality pedagogy has these 5 C's. No one's going to say they came to hear Chris Emden talk without getting a full lecture. 5 C's of reality pedagogy. Are you ready? Why do we need these 5 C's? Because a stem with no root. A stem with no root. A stem with no root. Much better. First C is this idea of the cipher. In hip-hop, there's this notion of the cipher. Who here has heard of a cipher or knows what a cipher is? A couple people. So in hip-hop, a cipher looks like this. You get a bunch of rappers, they get together, they may not know each other from Adam, and all of a sudden one starts rapping, and as one starts rapping, the other one's like, oh, word, that's an MC. So the other person runs to the cipher, and it gets into the space. And before you know it, I actually did research on this. I actually implanted 2 rappers on a bunch of major streets across the United States, and I timed how long it took from the 2 rappers rapping to each other to evolve into a cipher. And in each instance, in less than 15 minutes, the 2 rappers ended up being at least 5 rappers, and they all entered into the most beautiful thing ever, called a cipher. 1, without knowing each other, they start positioning themselves in a circle. Without knowing each other, they stand equidistant from each other. Without knowing each other, they have equal turns at talk. So for example, if I'm rapping and then you want to rap next, you don't tap me on the shoulder and say, ooh, could you pick me next? Like, that doesn't happen, right? I automatically have these rules of engagement, right? I start nodding my head. I start doing, And all of a sudden, when you do that, I'm like, okay, fine, it's time for somebody else. So I dwindle it down, and the next person goes. This beautiful structure of engagement that you find in young people who are part of hip-hop culture is completely antithetical to the rules of engagement in traditional classrooms. Meaning that kids know how to interact appropriately, exchange turns at talk, be respectful, listen closely, give positive reinforcement and positive feedback just by virtue of being hip-hop. But they can't do it in classrooms. So I make the argument that classrooms then have to replicate the structures of the cipher. In your after-school session, open up with a cipher. Have kids sit in circle and share their ideas. Close with a cipher. And have them have equal turns at talk and exchange ideas. The second C, birth from hip-hop also, co-teaching. When was the last time that you saw a rapper on stage alone? Even Jay-Z goes on stage with an entourage. What does that mean? It means that in classrooms then, the idea of having kids share ideas has to be them sharing ideas as a unit, as a crew, to replicate what happens in hip-hop. 3rd, cosmopolitanism. 4th, I'll say that slower, cosmopolitanism, right? 4th, context, and then last, content. But Chris Emden, you're a scientist. Content is last? Yes. Because if you do not address the social dynamics in the classroom space with young people, have them have an opportunity to share their ideas, have them have an opportunity to co-teach, have them have an opportunity to feel like they're connected, you could never get to the content. And this is why we have the kind of achievement gaps we have, is because we're so focused on shoving content down the throats of young people that they're socially disconnected. And if you don't address the social disconnection first, you'll never get to the content. Now, this is not to say that some kids won't be successful. There's always that kid in the classroom who's like, yes, teacher, oppress me more. You know, like there's always that glutton for punishment. But the reality is that the majority of young people in classrooms, those who are getting pushed out of classrooms, who are completely disengaged from classrooms, those are the ones that we want to get back in. Next slide. So I want to show you a cipher. Okay, skip it. Next slide. Next slide. You could skip. Next slide. Now, I want you to see the structural similarities between those 2 slides. If they were right in front of me, I'll go back and forth. So you get those rappers in BET, right? And they were all positioned in a circle. And then you saw that classroom, and the kids were all sitting how? In a circle. You had the rapper who said the cipher, the beginning of rap, describing a cipher, going in circles. And you had the kid who's explaining using her hands. And in that classroom, that is when you get the most powerful approach to teaching. That instance there was a young lady in my classroom, I was teaching at the time, who was getting a 90 in all her classes, and then all of a sudden, she just started flunking the class, and I couldn't understand why. And, and she was also the cool kid, and you guys know in your after-school sessions, like if the cool kids don't come to after school, what happens to the rest of the kids? They don't come. So in this instance, if the cool kid didn't like Emden anymore, guess what happens? None of the class likes Emden anymore. It's this affiliation, alienation dialectic. Oh, you're going to get me to almost preaching in here. Like, affiliation, alienation, if you understand that, you understand teaching, which is that everybody wants to affiliate to each other, and the affiliations are stronger if they have somebody to alienate. So if you ever went to I don't know, you guys are not from New York, I'm from New York, so I go to a Yankees game, right? All right, New York in the building, holla. All right, so you go to a Yankees game, and the Yankees are playing like, I don't know, the Angels, right? Right? And it's just like a regular game. People are sitting there chilling, they're like, oh, nice game. I mean, the Yankees gonna win anyway, so, why are you concerned, right? So we watch the full game. And then you go to a Yankees game when they're playing the Red Sox. And all of a sudden, like, people in the Bronx are giving each other hugs, and they're like, we're gonna annihilate them, right? And then imagine if one person has the audacity to walk into Yankee Stadium with a Red Sox jersey on. Somebody said, go Sox. Don't say that in the Bronx, buddy. All right, and all of a sudden, the connections that the people have to each other are so more solidly connected because they have somebody to alienate. That is part and parcel of teaching and learning. Unless you create an opportunity where you have an affiliation with the young people, you become a person who they will then alienate. And they will solidify their structural networks to each other based on the fact that you are ostracized. So that leads us to that classroom. So the young lady was like, she ended up failing my classroom. I couldn't get her to connect back. So then we said, you know what? We're going to have a cogenerative dialogue or a cipher. I invited 4 kids to have a conversation with me, and I invited her as well. And of course, they all sat in a circle, and the whole time she just looked at me with this evil face, right? And I couldn't understand, what was going on. And so we started talking, and then at one point she goes, I don't like you. And they all looked like, oh boy. And she goes, I say, why? You were doing so well in my class. She said, the other day, a teacher walked by the hallway and said, she's a slacker. And then you said, yup, she is. And I was like, I did? I didn't even remember. But that's what we do, adults. Because, again, we want to form our own affiliations. So we're like, she's a slacker? Yes, she's a slacker. She's awful, right? That's just what we have a tendency to do. And she said, because from that point on, I'm not doing your work anymore. And again, it's a big moment in teaching. When a young person tells you, I'm not doing your work, as opposed to I'm not doing my work, then you know that they don't have any ownership or investment in the activity, and they will never be successful. They will be at their own detriment just to make you feel horrible because they're not doing your work. And so that clip goes on, and at the end of it, she goes, you know what? I'm not down with that. And I said, you know what? I'm so sorry. Next time somebody says something like that about you, I'll say, come to the classroom and see how she works. And just like that, she extended her hand, she shook my hand, and it was over. And the next class, she was a 90 student again. Why? Because you take the time to create a structure that replicates their experiences outside of the classroom, that calls forth their hip-hop traditions, and that turns them back on to teaching and learning. The second there is co-teaching. Slide, right? Co-teaching. What do I mean by co-teaching? Yeah, Wu-Tang, I'll tell you the Wu-Tang story in a few minutes. I got time, right? Co-teaching is when you have the young people to take the helm of the classroom, like MCs and rappers on the stage. It doesn't matter if one person is a multi-platinum selling artist or the other person is just his boy from the block. They all get on that stage and they all rock that show together. In the classroom, in order to get young people to engage, what we have to do is allow them to be able to teach and allow them to have opportunity for expertise. What I do in my classrooms is simple. I give kids every single tool that I would use to get my lesson across. Take the lesson plan, take the websites, take the teachers, well, maybe not the teacher's manual. I had an experience where that never came back. Long story. But you take all the tools to be able to teach that lesson, and then you have the young people teach that lesson and have them be the person who rocked that show. And where do you sit as a teacher? You sit where they would have sat. And you never interrupt that lesson. And you only raise your hand to answer a question like a student. What that does is it gives the young people an investment in the classroom. It allows them to really rock that show. And co-teaching is an anchor of hip-hop pedagogy or reality pedagogy. Next slide. And why I put Wu-Tang there is because Wu-Tang is a perfect example of co-teaching in action. Like all 12 of them, you can't divide them from each other. They're all Wu-Tang, even though they're individuals. The third C is cosmopolitanism. Now look what it says there in red. Gang culture after school. Whether we like it or not, hip-hop and gang culture have been culturally synonymous. And I make the argument that what we want to do is we want to deconstruct everything in hip-hop to be able to bring that into the classroom to be better educators. So I want to look at what is it that gang members are doing to recruit young people that are allowing them not to connect to the classroom. and take those cues and use them in my classroom. When I was a kid, my mom always used to say, Chris, little drops of water make a mighty ocean. And at the time, I thought my mom was crazy because I'm like, Mom, we don't live near a beach. What are you talking about? But she always used to say, little drops of water make a mighty ocean. And under cosmopolitanism, it is always the seemingly insignificant practices of the educator that are the little drops that make the mighty ocean of revolution in classrooms. So for example, the pound. Who knows what a pound is? The handshake. Do you know how powerful it is that when you only give handshakes to students in classrooms once they get an answer right? So you're going to go into that classroom and you're going to pose questions. And the kid answers a question. And if he answers that question and gets it correctly, you go over there and you give him your own special pound. Almost like a gang handshake. Who's seen a gang handshake before? A gang handshake lasts like 3 to 8 minutes. It's like patty cake. Like, I remember the first time I saw a gang, I was like, but you're a gangster. Why are you doing this? Like, you know, right? But the cultural significance of the handshake is that it's so nuanced and special that it allows us to connect to each other in a way that other people can't connect. And so if you can bring that structure into the classroom, young people, so you'll give the first handshake, and all the kids in the classroom are going to look at you like, whatever, that's corny. And then you're going to go to the next class, and you give that handshake to the next kid who gets the answer correct. And guess what happens by the third class? Everybody wants to get an answer right so they can get the handshake. Why? So they can create some affiliation with you and the content. That's cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is making sure that in your after-school program, every single person has a role, but the role has nothing to do with learning. What? I thought you were an educator. It has nothing to do with learning, but has everything to do with the fact that you are part of this crew. So one person is the board eraser, one person is the bag picker-upper, one person is the copy maker, one person is the messenger, and you let them know and feel like this after-school session wouldn't run, not with my content, it just wouldn't run if you weren't here. I'll tell you a quick story. It was 2002, and I was teaching a classroom in the Bronx, and this young lady came to the classroom on Monday and said, Dr. E, I'm not going to be on Friday. My pops, I haven't seen him in like 10 years, and he's coming to take us to Disney World on Friday. And I was like, great, thanks for sharing. Usually you guys just don't show up. This is awesome, right? And then on Tuesday she comes and she tells me the exact same story. And then Wednesday she's excited again. And so on Thursday, you know, of course, same story. And so on Friday, I didn't expect her to come in. The school day starts. I'm sitting there, I'm teaching my lesson, and guess who walks in? And she walks right into the classroom and she sits down. And in my head, I am like intellectual. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy disappointed her. And then she was acting normally. So I'm like, oh my gosh, it's worse than I thought. She's deflecting. It's, you know, it's a psychological issue. Like, I'm like, then I'm like, she must be so sad and so I should give her a hug. You know, male teacher, female student, it's a problem now. I can't give her a hug. What do I do? Like, I'm thinking through all these scenarios in my head about why she was in school and how this guy disappointed her. And then after school, I was like, yo, Maribel, like, are you good? Are you okay? And she goes like, yeah, I'm good. Like, why'd you ask? And I said, but I thought you were going to, you know, Disney World or land or whatever. She's like, yeah, with my pops, but I had to cancel on dude. And I said, you had to cancel on dude? Like, what do you mean? She said, yeah, I had to cancel on dude because I remembered that it was Friday and it was a lab day and I'm the equipment distributor. So if I don't come to the classroom, who's going to give out the microscopes? What was happening there? She felt so connected in a cosmopolitan way to the structures of the classroom that she was willing to forego a meeting with her biological father to be into that classroom. Now, you can't tell me that a person who comes in for that reason is not going to be willing to learn. But it requires creating a structure to have her emotionally connect in order for her to learn. Without the emotional connection, there is no learning. And we have not done this yet in the world of education. We have not had standards yet that talk about the culture of young people and having them emotionally invested in what goes on in classrooms. The fourth C, next slide, is context, meaning that you have to, you know, have pride in whatever it is that you're from. If I go to a Boost school in Ontario and I go to one in LA, they should kind of look the same, but they should sound completely different. There needs to be a certain distinctive vibe that speaks to the community. Because in hip-hop, it's all about the community. You can spot off a rapper, I know exactly where they come from, right? Because in every rap, they tell about their hood. It's that connectedness to that place. Like Snoop is from, you know, 213, and Jay-Z is from Brooklyn. We know he's from Brooklyn. We also know that he's from Marcy Project. We also know that he's from Apartment 4B. He didn't tell anybody this literally. He told us this in his work. So for young people, the connectedness to their communities is so significant that part of your practice has to be always to connect what you're teaching to exactly where it is that they're from. That is hip-hop, and that is reality pedagogy. And the last C is content. Next slide. So now, in my last sort of 5 minutes, I want to show you what classrooms or schools look like in the United States. I get emotional looking at this slide sometimes still. When people took Native American populations and they said they were going to educate them. And in the process of educating them, they took them from different places across the country and brought them to these schools. And they made them cut their hair off, they made them sit appropriately, they made them sit in rows. And if you look at those faces, there's not one smile in those faces. And we will all argue as progressive educators that we don't want our classrooms to look at that like that. Next slide. But in the 90s, the kids are now seated in different groups. They may be sitting in rooms of 4, but that's no different than the last slide. It's no different in our contemporary classrooms than the initial slide because we still have not focused explicitly on using youth culture in the classroom. We could call ourselves progressive all we want, but if youth are deeply embedded and connected to hip-hop culture nowadays, it is the biggest cultural artifact of our time. The United States uses hip-hop as a mechanism in places across the globe so they can have connections to the young people. But in classrooms, we don't use it. Next slide. How far have we come? Sure, we have smart boards in classrooms. But what's the sense of having a smart board if the kids who are smart are bored? We now have iPads. But what's the purpose of an iPad if a kid can say, I profusely, and admittedly, I'm disinterested in what's going on in this classroom? Even the flipped classroom. It's been described as a revolution in education. I'm not anti-flip, I'm just saying this. You could flip a classroom inside, outside, and backwards and say it's a revolution. What's a revolution? A revolution is going around 360 degrees. You start here, and you end up where you started, and that's technically a revolution. A flipped classroom can be amazing, but if the flipped classroom doesn't focus on utilizing people who are embedded in the youth communities as the person who's disseminating the information, then it's purposeless. If the person who's teaching is in some place far away and can never connect the culture to a young person in LA, they can get some part of the information, but the cultural connector is not there, and the extent to which they can truly connect is limited. Next slide. This is today's classroom, where a teacher asks a question and a young man is in the back. He tries to answer. Regroups. Tries again. Tries again. Tries again. Tries again. There's humor in it, but it's also something that should tug at our heartstrings. Because in this instance, in a classroom in 2013, what he's learning in that classroom is no different at all than what a Native American student was learning in an Americanized classroom before. No different. Next slide. And it could even look like they're engaged. All those kids raised their hands. And I wish I could show you this slower. But what happened is that the students have become trained into the culture of the classroom, so much so that they've learned to give you what you want, even though they're not truly learning. Those kids' 4 hands went up simultaneously, almost instantaneously. The teacher hadn't even finished posing the question. They've acclimated to the culture of the institution. Because if I raise my hand, then he won't call on me, and that's all he wants anyway, then I can put my hand back down. And that, to me, is a reflection of the absence of their culture in their classroom, because there's no space to know how they communicate, how they interact. And if there's no space to understand how they communicate and interact, they start donning the structure of the traditional classroom at the detriment of their knowledge and information. I will slowly close, next slide, by talking about Jizza from the Wu-Tang Clan and our newest initiative. And I'm arguing that you guys be a part of this initiative. If you go right now on PBS and type in PBS and JIZA, we have a competition where we're getting young kids to be engaged in science through hip-hop. A competition across the globe for kids to be able to write raps about science and win a shout-out from JIZA. And why JIZA's story is so powerful is that this man is an example of what a whole bunch of young people in classrooms are experiencing today. A person who went to school up into the 10th grade, loved science, saw himself as an intellectual, but could not find his culture represented in the classroom. And so he left school to form a rap group. And it became one of the most successful rap groups of all time. And then a year ago, he started going to all these universities across the globe and meeting scientists and learning more about science because they hear he's JIZA from the Wu-Tang Clan, so they welcome him in. But think about this for a second. What if he didn't end up being a multimillionaire? What if that hip-hop career didn't work out? Then he would have been another one of millions of young people who were pushed out of classroom because their culture wasn't represented. Next slide. So that's the Science Genius Project. And right now, kids are writing raps, and then we're seeing different types of responses. Next slide. We're seeing kids express their science-mindedness. We're seeing kids show that all the skills and dispositions of the most prolific scientists of our time, we find in young people who are creating hip-hop. When Einstein said that he was imagining himself riding a light beam in outer space, and that's how he came up with the theory of relativity, and a kid in the Bronx is saying, I'm imagining myself floating through my projects. That means that that young man is no different than Einstein if his culture was allowed to be connected to the classroom. And we look at all the skills of the best scientists, observation skills, skeptics, they're curious, they're analytical. And anybody who writes a dope rhyme has to express those same skills. But if you don't bring the culture in, they don't have a way to hone those skills to connect to science. Next slide. Use hip-hop. Next slide, because I'm running out of time. Funny, yes, but powerful. Because he's not saying, I will do whatever it takes to ensure that I learn as much science as possible to incorporate into my rap so I can be better than the next person. And that's hip-hop, the battle. And when you bring that culture in with that type of motivation, it's very different than that kid who put his head down. Next slide. Juxtapose that against the young ladies who put their hands up in 2 seconds before the teacher even answered a question. That's louder, it's more engaged, it's more exciting, but that's their culture. The classroom must change. They don't have to change. Because if we're expecting them to change, it's just not going to happen. Because they're too deeply connected to other people who are like them and they have all their needs met. They're affiliated to each other so deeply that they don't care what you have to say. In order for them to be truly connected, we have to change. Next slide. This is not just empty work. Recent neuroscientific research has indicated that when you have MCs who are engaged in freestyle rap, parts of the brain that control creativity, activity, and paying attention are activated through fMRIs. I don't think you get this. That engaging in the practice of hip-hop, the art of freestyle in classrooms, activates part of the brains that usually would lay dormant in traditional classrooms. At the same time, parts of the brain that control self-control and management behavior are deactivated when kids are memorizing like they do in traditional classrooms. In other words, we've got the solution to the classroom management issues. Because essentially what the study is saying that when kids are memorizing and sitting docile in classrooms, their parts of their brain that control their self-control are deactivated, meaning they can't control themselves. Meaning that when you're complaining about kids having poor behavior in your boring classroom, it's because neuroscientifically, they're not acclimated to perform appropriately in that structure of a classroom. And at the same time, when they're engaged in freestyle rap, parts of the brain that support their learning are activated. Meaning then that this is not just Chris talking about what should work culturally. Neuroscientifically, we must amend our practice to meet the kids on their cultural turf. Next slide. I call it the rebirth of cool. Next slide. I'm done. And I got to do in the spirit of hip-hop some self-promo. My book, I'll be signing them at 12. And listen, I brought 34 books all the way from New York, and I don't intend to carry them back. So pick up the book, Urban Science Education for the Hip-Hop Generation. And then finally, I just want to leave with one quote, right? And remember in my rap I talk about, I'm off Newton, I'm on Einstein. I like Einstein because Einstein's mind is like mine. What I loved about Einstein is that he didn't talk about science. He talked about music, he talked about art, he talked about culture. And one of his most profound quotes says, you cannot solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. We must start the world anew. And then Audre Lorde once said, the master's tools will not destroy the master's house. In essence, the approaches to teaching and learning that have been developed in academia, the approaches to teaching and learning that have been developed in our classrooms, the approaches to teaching and learning that we've read about and memorized and try to put in classrooms will not change the game of education. The tools that we need are those that are in our communities. And one thing we can say about hip-hop is it's not the master's tool. And so we have to be able to utilize this to transform the world of education. Thank you.